April 9th, 1986. Soviet radar operators in the Baltic region stared at their screens in disbelief. An American reconnaissance aircraft had just entered their airspace at 70,000 feet. This was routine, arrogant, but routine. The Americans had been testing Soviet defenses for decades. But something was wrong. The radar operator recalculated the speed reading 3 times, Mach 3.2. Impossible. No aircraft on Earth could sustain that velocity. He contacted his commander immediately. Launch missiles. Full spread. 6 SA-5 Gammon surface-to-air missiles erupted from their launchers across 3 different sites. Each missile represented the pinnacle of Soviet engineering. Each one had cost more than a MiG fighter jet. Each one was designed to kill anything that flew. The American crew saw them coming, 6 white contrails arcing upward through the stratosphere, proximity alarms screaming in their headsets. The pilot, Major Brian Shul, had been in this situation before. He knew exactly what to do. He pushed the throttles forward. The SR-71 Blackbird accelerated. Mach 3.3, Mach 3.5. Every single missile fell behind, their rocket motors exhausted, tumbling back to Earth like expensive fireworks. The Blackbird didn't just survive, it was never even close to danger. The Soviets called it Nedosya-Gamy, the unreachable one. For 3 decades, the Soviet Union had laughed at America's obsession with spy planes. They considered it wasteful, paranoid, typical American excess. Why spend billions on reconnaissance aircraft when satellites could do the job from orbit? The Soviets had built the most sophisticated air defense network in human history. Over 10,000 surface-to-air missiles positioned across 11 time zones. MiG interceptors capable of reaching 70,000 feet. A radar grid so dense that not even birds could cross Soviet airspace undetected. And they were confident, arrogantly confident. Then America introduced the SR-71 Blackbird, and that confidence evaporated overnight. This wasn't just another spy plane. This was something that violated every assumption Soviet military planners had made about aviation. A machine made of titanium and secrets that flew higher than missiles could reach and faster than bullets could follow. An aircraft that broke every rule of aerodynamics and somehow made it work. Over its 30-year operational lifetime, the SR-71 flew thousands of reconnaissance missions over hostile territory. More than 4,000 missiles were fired at Blackbirds during operational flights. Not one ever connected. This is the story of how American engineers turned an impossible dream into the Cold War's most feared machine. How Soviet pilots went from mockery to terror, and how one aircraft rewrote the entire playbook of aerial espionage. May 1st, 1960. The day American invincibility died, a Soviet SA-2 surface-to-air missile struck CYA pilot Francis Gary Powers at 70,000 feet over Sverdlovsk. His U-2 spy plane, America's most closely guarded secret, spiraled to Earth in pieces. Powers parachuted into Soviet custody. Within hours, his aircraft wreckage was being examined by Soviet engineers. Within days, he was confessing on Soviet television. President Eisenhower faced reporters looking exhausted and betrayed. For the first time in the Cold War, America had been caught red-handed conducting espionage deep inside Soviet territory. The diplomatic fallout was catastrophic. A planned summit with Soviet Premier Khrushchev collapsed. America's moral authority crumbled. But here's what the world didn't know. 2 years before Powers was shot down, the CIA already knew the U-2 was living on borrowed time. In 1958, in a classified briefing room at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, a panel of Air Force generals and intelligence operatives gathered around one urgent question. What comes after the U-2? Soviet missiles were getting faster. Soviet radar was getting better. The U-2's advantage was measured in months, not years. America needed something radically different, something that couldn't be shot down, something so fast and so high that even knowing it was there wouldn't matter. The answer walked into that briefing room wearing a short-sleeved shirt with a slide rule in his pocket. His name was Clarence Kelly Johnson, and he was a legend. He'd designed the U-2, the P-38 Lightning fighter, the F-104 Starfighter. Nearly every revolutionary aircraft America had ever flown had come from Johnson's mind. Johnson ran a secretive unit inside Lockheed called Skunk Works, named after a foul-smelling plastics factory next door. It was a team of barely 50 engineers working in a windowless building, solving problems years ahead of the rest of the aviation industry at a fraction of the cost. In July 1958, Johnson presented his proposal to the CIA. Not an improved U-2, not a minor upgrade, something that defied everything aviation engineers thought was possible. An aircraft that would cruise at Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound, at 85,000 feet, 16 miles above the Earth. Made almost entirely of titanium, a metal so rare and difficult that no one had ever built an aircraft from it. A plane that would leak fuel on the runway because its panels only sealed properly when heated to 500 degrees at altitude. CIA Director Allen Dulles stared at the blueprints and asked the only question that mattered. "Kelly, can you actually build this?" Johnson smiled. "Give me 2 years and $100 million, and stay out of my way." Project Oxcart was born. Building the Blackbird wasn't difficult. It was borderline impossible. Titanium was the only metal that could survive the heat generated at Mach 3. Air friction would turn the aircraft's skin into a glowing oven, reaching temperatures over 600 degrees Fahrenheit. Aluminum would melt. Steel was too heavy. Only titanium could handle it. There was just one problem. Nobody knew how to work with titanium. Conventional welding torches contaminated the metal. Standard drill bits shattered on contact. Cadmium-plated tools used throughout the aviation industry caused titanium to corrode instantly. Even tap water from Burbank, California, where Skunk Works was located, contained too much chlorine. The metal cracked during heat treatment. Kelly Johnson's team had to invent entirely new manufacturing processes from scratch. They developed specialized welding techniques, created custom drill bits, built temperature-controlled facilities. They even had to source their titanium carefully. Here's where it gets strange. In 1960, the Soviet Union was the world's largest producer of titanium. America didn't have enough domestic supply. So the CIA, through a web of shell corporations, secretly purchased Soviet titanium to build the spy plane that would fly over the Soviet Union. The irony was exquisite, but technical problems were only the beginning. The SR-71 program faced skepticism from every direction. Air Force generals questioned whether any pilot could survive sustained Mach 3 flight. NASA engineers calculated that the aerodynamic heating would warp the airframe beyond recognition. Cost analysts predicted the program would bankrupt the defense budget. Aviation magazines ran articles with titles like the titanium Turkey, and Lockheed's Mach 3 Mirage. Critics pointed to the U-2 shootdown as proof that spy planes were obsolete. Why not invest in satellites instead? Even within the CIA, doubts festered. The U-2 had cost $20 million per aircraft. The Blackbird was projected at $34 million each, and that estimate kept climbing. Some officials whispered that Kelly Johnson had finally gone too far, that his ambition had exceeded even his legendary capabilities. Test flights at Area 51's Groom Lake facility did nothing to calm nerves. Early prototypes experienced engine failures, hydraulic leaks, and electrical fires. During one test in 1963, the aircraft pitched violently and disintegrated mid-air. Test pilot Bill Park ejected at Mach 2.8 and survived, barely. The accident investigation revealed over 300 design flaws. Newspaper reporters who caught wind of the program through leaks called it Johnson's folly. Pentagon budget hawks demanded cancellation. The Soviets, monitoring American aviation developments through their spy networks, dismissed the entire project as propaganda. They were laughing at the impossible airplane. They wouldn't laugh for long. December 22, 1964. Beale Air Force Base, California. Dawn, barely breaking over the Sierra Nevada mountains. A pilot named Robert Bob Gilliland climbed into the cockpit of a black aircraft unlike anything that had ever flown. This wasn't a test prototype. This was the first production SR-71 Blackbird, built to operational standards, ready to prove whether Kelly Johnson's obsession had been genius or madness. Gilliland had been briefed extensively. He knew the risks. At Mach 3, any malfunction could tear the aircraft apart before he could react. The ejection seat was theoretically rated for high-speed escape, but theoretically was a word that killed test pilots. He fired up the engines. The Pratt & Whitney J-58 turbojets roared to life, sounding like controlled explosions. The entire airframe vibrated. Fuel leaked from the tanks onto the tarmac, exactly as designed. At room temperature, the titanium panels had microscopic gaps between them. Only at operational temperature would they expand and seal properly. Gilliland released the brakes. The Blackbird accelerated down the runway and lifted off, climbing at an angle that made conventional aircraft look sluggish by comparison. 15 minutes later, he was at 75,000 feet. He pushed the throttles forward and engaged afterburners. The J-58 engines transitioned into ramjet mode, a hybrid propulsion system that had never been attempted on an operational aircraft. Mach 1, Mach 2. The airframe began heating up. Gilliland monitored dozens of instruments, watching temperatures, pressures, and structural stress indicators. Everything was climbing into the red zones, but nothing was failing. Mach 2.5. The cockpit windows grew warm to the touch. Outside, the sky turned deep purple. At this altitude, you could see the curvature of the Earth. Mach 3. The Blackbird was now flying faster than a rifle bullet. Gilliland felt the aircraft stabilize. The buffeting stopped. The instruments settled. For the first time in history, sustained Mach 3 flight wasn't killing the pilot or destroying the plane. It was smooth, almost peaceful. Gilliland radioed back to Beale. "She flies like a dream." In the control room, Kelly Johnson allowed himself a rare smile. 5 years of mockery, $300 million spent, 2 pilots dead in test accidents, endless congressional hearings, and now, finally, vindication. The Blackbird wasn't just possible, it was magnificent. Over the next 6 months, test pilots pushed the aircraft further. Mach 3.2 at 80,000 feet, sustained supersonic cruise for over an hour, reconnaissance cameras that could photograph a newspaper headline from 16 miles up, electronic countermeasures that could jam Soviet radar. But the real breakthrough came during a simulated combat scenario in 1965. Air Force technicians fired live SA-2 missiles at an SR-71 over the Pacific Test Range, the same missile type that had killed Francis Gary Powers. The Blackbird detected the launch, accelerated, and left the missiles behind like they were standing still. The implications hit immediately. Soviet air defense, the most sophisticated network on Earth, had just been rendered obsolete by a single aircraft design. CIA analysts ran the numbers. An SR-71 flying at optimal altitude and speed was effectively invulnerable. Missiles couldn't catch it. Interceptors couldn't reach it. Even if the Soviets knew exactly where it was, they couldn't stop it. The Pentagon's tune changed overnight. Suddenly, the program that had been dismissed as wasteful excess became the crown jewel of American reconnaissance capability. Orders increased. Training accelerated. By late 1965, the first operational SR-71 squadron was preparing for real-world missions. The Blackbird was no longer a prototype. It was a weapon. And the Soviets had no idea what was about to hit them. Flying the Blackbird wasn't like flying any other aircraft. It required a complete reimagining of pilot training, mission planning, and reconnaissance doctrine. First, the pilots themselves. The Air Force established the most selective training program in military aviation history. Candidates needed thousands of hours in high-performance jets, perfect physical health, and psychological profiles indicating extreme stability under pressure. Out of hundreds of applicants, only a handful made it through. Why so selective? Because piloting an SR-71 meant managing a machine that wanted to kill you in a dozen different ways simultaneously. At Mach 3, you couldn't turn sharply. The G-forces would black you out or tear the wings off. You couldn't descend quickly. Rapid deceleration could cause catastrophic structural failure. You had to think 30 miles ahead because that's how far you traveled in 6 minutes. The aircraft required a two-man crew, pilot and reconnaissance systems officer, the RSO. They sat in separate cockpits, wearing full pressure suits identical to those worn by astronauts. At operational altitude, cabin pressure loss meant instant death. The pressure suits were the only thing between the crew and the vacuum of near space. Missions were planned with obsessive precision. Every flight path was calculated to the second. Fuel consumption at Mach 3 was staggering. The Blackbird burned 5,000 gallons per hour. Without mid-air refueling, range was severely limited. So every operational mission included multiple rendezvous with KC-135Q tanker aircraft specially modified to carry the SR-71's unique JP-7 fuel. This fuel was so stable it wouldn't ignite, even if you dropped a lit match into it. Standard jet fuel would explode at Mach 3 temperatures. JP-7 barely smoldered. The refueling process itself was an engineering marvel. The Blackbird would slow to subsonic speed, descend to meet the tanker, connect, take on fuel, disconnect, then re-accelerate to Mach 3 and climb back to operational altitude. All of this had to happen with perfect coordination, often in radio silence over hostile territory. Navigation required new techniques. At Mach 3, You cross an entire time zone in under 12 minutes. Traditional navigation landmarks become meaningless. The SR-71's RSO used a combination of inertial navigation, star tracking, and eventually primitive satellite positioning to maintain accurate location data. Reconnaissance systems evolved rapidly. Early missions used film cameras that captured images on physical film, which had to be developed after landing. Later missions incorporated signals intelligence equipment that could intercept Soviet radar and communications in real time. The CIA and Air Force developed entirely new mission profiles. Instead of penetrating deep into Soviet territory like the U-2 had done, SR-71s often flew along borders at high speed, using side-looking cameras and sensors to photograph hundreds of miles inland without technically violating airspace. This technique, called standoff reconnaissance, reduced political risk while maintaining intelligence value. The Blackbird could photograph a Soviet missile base from international airspace, fly away before interceptors scrambled, and be landing at a friendly base before Soviet commanders even finished their alert protocols. Maintenance became a specialized art form. After each flight, crews spent 20 hours inspecting and servicing the aircraft. The titanium skin had to be examined for stress cracks. The engines required complete teardowns every 100 hours. The reconnaissance systems needed calibration and film reloading. Ground crews developed an almost religious devotion to the aircraft. They understood that sloppy maintenance didn't just risk an expensive machine. It meant sending pilots into a situation where the only defense was speed, and mechanical failure meant certain death. By 1967, the SR-71 program had developed into a mature operational system. Doctrine was established. Pilots were trained. Missions were routine, if anything about Mach 3 flight could ever be called routine. And the Soviets were finally beginning to understand what they were facing. The first confirmed SR-71 overflight of Soviet territory occurred in early 1967. Soviet radar operators detected it immediately. They tracked it with growing alarm, and they couldn't do a single thing to stop it. In the control room beneath Moscow's Air Defense Headquarters, General Yevgeny Savitsky watched the radar track with fury. The American aircraft was flying along the Soviet coast at 80,000 feet and Mach 3. His SA-5 missile batteries were firing. His MiG-25 interceptors were scrambling. Nothing was getting close. Savitsky ordered missile battery commanders to fire everything available. Over the next hour, Soviet forces launched 23 missiles at that single aircraft. Everyone missed. The Blackbird simply outran them, occasionally accelerating when missiles approached, leaving them tumbling into the ocean. When the aircraft finally exited Soviet radar coverage, Savitsky contacted the Kremlin. His report was blunt. Soviet air defense was obsolete. This assessment sent shockwaves through the Soviet military establishment. They'd spent decades and billions of rubles building an air defense network specifically designed to prevent American reconnaissance aircraft from penetrating their airspace. And now, a single American plane was making it all look like an expensive joke. Soviet intelligence went into overdrive. The KGB assigned entire departments to understanding the Blackbird. They bribed Lockheed employees. They analyzed satellite photos of Beale Air Force Base. They intercepted communications between SR-71 crews and ground control. What they learned terrified them. The Americans weren't just flying occasional missions. They were running systematic reconnaissance operations, photographing Soviet military installations with impunity. Missile bases, naval facilities, nuclear test sites, everything was being documented in stunning detail. Intercepted documents revealed Soviet military analysts describing the SR-71 in terms usually reserved for science fiction. One intelligence report called it a vehicle from the future deployed in the present. Another assessment concluded no existing or planned Soviet weapon system can reliably intercept this aircraft. The psychological impact on Soviet forces was devastating. Pilots who'd trained their entire careers to defend Soviet airspace felt helpless. Missile crews watched their multi-million-ruble weapons fall uselessly from the sky. Commanders filed reports explaining their failures, knowing they sounded like excuses. Soviet propaganda tried to downplay the threat. State media claimed the SR-71 was just another American provocation, easily countered. But internal military documents told a different story. The aircraft represented a genuine crisis in Soviet strategic planning. Some Soviet responses bordered on desperate. They attempted to develop new interceptor aircraft with better altitude performance. The MiG-25 Foxbat, capable of reaching 80,000 feet, was deployed specifically to counter the Blackbird. But the Foxbat could only sustain that altitude for minutes before its engines overheated, while the SR-71 cruised there for hours. They developed new missiles with improved kinematics. The SA-5 Gammon system was repeatedly upgraded. They experimented with nuclear-tipped anti-aircraft missiles, reasoning that even a near miss might damage the Blackbird with electromagnetic pulse effects. Nothing worked reliably. Soviet air defense doctrine had been built on a simple premise: make Soviet airspace so dangerous that no enemy aircraft would survive penetration. The SR-71 shattered that premise. American aircraft were penetrating Soviet airspace routinely, photographing whatever they wanted, and flying away unscathed. The most damaging aspect wasn't military, it was psychological. The Soviet military had built its reputation on invincibility, on defending the motherland against all threats, and they couldn't stop one American spy plane. Soviet pilots began calling it the Ghost. You could see it on radar. You could fire at it, but you couldn't touch it. It flew through Soviet airspace like it owned the place, and there wasn't a damn thing anyone could do about it. That realization, more than any weapon system or military strategy, may have been the SR-71's greatest contribution to the Cold War. It made Soviet military leadership doubt themselves, and doubt is the first crack in any empire's foundation. By 1968, the SR-71 program shifted from experimental to fully operational. The Air Force established multiple squadrons at Beale Air Force Base in California. Additional detachments deployed to RAF Mildenhall in England and Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan. The Blackbird had become a global reconnaissance network. Production ramped up. Lockheed's Skunk Works ultimately built 32 SR-71 aircraft. This sounds modest, but each one cost $34 million in the 1960s money, equivalent to over $300 million today. The total program cost exceeded $1 billion, making it one of the most expensive aviation programs in history. But the Pentagon considered it money well spent. The intelligence gathered by SR-71 missions was transforming American understanding of Soviet military capabilities. Mission frequency increased dramatically. During peak operational periods, Blackbirds flew multiple reconnaissance missions per week. Flight paths were carefully choreographed to cover different target areas: Soviet missile installations, submarine bases, weapons testing facilities, troop concentrations along the Chinese border. Each mission generated thousands of images. The SR-71's cameras could photograph 100,000 square miles of terrain per hour. Flying at 16 miles altitude, the resolution was good enough to identify individual vehicles, count aircraft on airfields, and measure the dimensions of buildings. This intelligence was gold to Cold War strategists. Satellite reconnaissance existed, but satellites followed predictable orbits. The Soviets knew when American spy satellites passed overhead and could hide sensitive activities. The SR-71 appeared with no warning, traveled too fast to track reliably, and could photograph anything at any time. The aircraft's presence changed how America conducted strategic intelligence gathering. Before the Blackbird, the CIA relied on high-risk U-2 missions and unreliable human intelligence. After the Blackbird, America had on-demand reconnaissance of any location on Earth, with virtually no risk of aircraft loss. The pilots became an elite fraternity. Only about 85 men ever flew the SR-71 operationally. They wore distinctive pressure suits, underwent astronaut-level training, and were briefed on intelligence so sensitive that most details remain classified today. Missions typically lasted 6 hours. Pilots would launch from their home base, rendezvous with tankers 3 or 4 times, conduct high-speed reconnaissance runs over target areas, then return home. The physical toll was immense. Sustained Mach 3 flight meant sitting in a cramped cockpit in a full-pressure suit for half a day, managing an aircraft that demanded constant attention. Support infrastructure grew elaborate. Each deployed detachment required hundreds of support personnel: mechanics, fuel specialists, reconnaissance analysts, mission planners, security forces. The SR-71 didn't just deploy an aircraft, it deployed an entire intelligence-gathering ecosystem. Specialized facilities were constructed at deployment bases. Climate-controlled hangars protected the titanium airframes from extreme temperatures. Secure photo labs processed reconnaissance film immediately after landing. Communication centers transmitted intelligence data directly to the Pentagon and CIA headquarters. The logistics were staggering. JP-7 fuel wasn't available commercially. The Air Force had to transport it to deployment locations in dedicated tanker aircraft. Spare parts for the unique titanium airframe had to be manufactured by Lockheed and shipped worldwide. Each deployed aircraft required a support tail of equipment weighing hundreds of tons. But the operational record was impressive. Throughout the late 1960s and 1970s, SR-71s conducted thousands of reconnaissance missions. They photographed Soviet military exercises, monitored the Vietnam War from high altitude, tracked North Korean military movements, and provided intelligence during Middle Eastern conflicts. The aircraft's capability expanded beyond pure photography. Later variants carried signals intelligence equipment that could intercept radar emissions, communications, and electronic warfare systems. The Blackbird became not just a camera platform, but a comprehensive intelligence gathering system. By the mid-1970s, the SR-71 had achieved something remarkable. It had been deployed operationally for nearly a decade, flown thousands of missions over hostile territory, and never lost a single aircraft to enemy action.